behind me, around this bend, and between where we are today and the mouth of the Great Ogeechee River at the Atlantic Ocean, is Fort McAllister. Fort McAllister today is a really great state park. You can go fishing, you can go camping, you can go hiking. But in December of 1864, Fort McAllister is where Sherman's march to the sea ended. A force of about 4,000 men from Sherman's army attacked out of these woods behind the fort. Now, the fort was designed to protect Richmond Hill and eventually Savannah from the Union Navy out in the Atlantic Ocean. The fighting took about 15 minutes, and the military maneuvers for Sherman's march to the sea officially ended. Fort McAllister was important to Sherman's army because just around these bends at the mouth of the Ogeechee River in the Atlantic Ocean is the Union Navy. And when Sherman's army was able to make contact with the Union Navy that had been blocked by Fort McAllister, they were able to resupply their men, get food, get new clothes, get supplies. These men had been marching from Atlanta, which is like a 4-hour drive. So can you imagine walking that far? So they were able to reconnect with the Union Navy and get these supplies, getting ready to attack Savannah. We know that Savannah surrendered peacefully a few days later, and that the war would end here in Savannah when Sherman gifted the city of Savannah to President Lincoln for Christmas. Now, fighting the war, capturing Savannah, taking Fort McAllister and resupplying his men with the Union Navy, these aren't the only things that Sherman had to worry about in December of 1864 and January of 1865. As Sherman was coming down from Atlanta, his army began to get a few extra passengers that they hadn't quite planned for. Freed slaves from the plantations and farms in the backcountry of Georgia began to follow Sherman's army. Now, Sherman didn't exactly have a great reputation for his relationship with the African Americans who were following his army. This all came to a head at Ebenezer Creek, outside of Springfield, Georgia. As Sherman's army was crossing the creek, they ordered that the bridge that they had built be removed before the freed slaves could cross the creek, or the river. Now, several of these slaves drowned in the river as they were trying to follow the army. Those who didn't drown in the river were either captured or killed by the Confederates that were following the army. Secretary of War Stanton up in Washington, D.C. was beginning to get worried about what Sherman was going to do with the freed slaves that were following his army. He came down to Savannah in January of 1865 and had a meeting with Sherman to settle the problem. Almost a month after taking Fort McAllister and Richmond Hill, General Sherman and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton met with 20 ministers from the African American community here at the Green Meldrum House in downtown Savannah. The meeting was designed to come up with a plan for what to do to help the freed people after the Civil War. Because of the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves had been freed in all of the rebelling territories within the Union. That includes Georgia. However, a lot of these freed slaves didn't discover the Emancipation Proclamation or couldn't act on the Emancipation Proclamation until Sherman and his men came to town. Now, of these 20 ministers, a majority of them were born into slavery. Some of them bought their freedom from their owners, some of them gained freedom when their owners died, and then some gained freedom when Sherman's men came into the towns where they were living. One of these men was Garrison Frazier. Frazier was born into slavery in North Carolina and bought freedom for he and his wife for about $1,000 in gold and silver. When asked how he thought the freed people should live in the Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida Lowcountry, Frazier said that he thought it would be best for these freed African Americans to have their own land that they could pass down through the generations, that they could do what they wanted with so that they could have economic freedom, rather than living amongst the white community that had oppressed them and kept them in bondage for so long. Following the events at Ebenezer Creek, the United States government was concerned about General Sherman's relationship with the African American community. Part of Edwin Stanton's mission on his trip down to Savannah was to determine how the African American communities felt about General Sherman and his army that had occupied their territories. Sherman was asked to leave the room so that Stanton could talk to the group in private. Garrison Frazier, being the person chosen to represent the entire group, answered Stanton's questions. Stanton asked, "State what is the feeling of the colored people in regard to General Sherman, and how far do they regard his sentiments and actions as friendly to their rights and interests or otherwise?" Frazier responded, "We looked upon General Sherman prior to his arrival as a man in the providence of God, specially set apart to accomplish this work, and we unanimously feel inexpressible gratitude toward him.
looking upon him as a man that should be honored for the faithful performance of his duty. Some of us called upon him immediately upon his arrival, and it is probable that he would not meet the secretary with more courtesy than he met us. His conduct and deportment toward us characterized him as a friend and a gentleman. We have confidence in General Sherman and think that what concerns us could not be under better hands. This is our opinion now from the short acquaintance and interest we have had. The events at Ebenezer Creek were shocking, and don't overlook the fact that Sherman's orders were likely due to military expedience and not just his general interest towards helping the African American community. Tens of thousands of freed slaves were now following Sherman's army, and as he began his campaign towards South Carolina, in which he would destroy the capital city of Columbia, he couldn't afford to protect or feed those freed slaves who were following him. By establishing a territory on which they could settle in the lands on coastal Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida, he could offload these freed slaves and give them a chance to start their own lives.
This meeting resulted in General Sherman issuing Special Order 15. Now, this is commonly referred to as the order that granted 40 acres and a mule to all the freed slaves. Now, some of these families actually did get mules from the army, but for the most part what it meant was that land was divided up in tracts of no more than 40 acres, from Charleston in South Carolina down to Florida. About 400,000 acres of land that had been confiscated from Confederates who were fighting in rebellion against the United States was divided up amongst these freed slaves. Now, unfortunately, this order didn't last. After President Lincoln was assassinated, Vice President Andrew Johnson took over the presidency. He wasn't too fond of Special Field Order 15 and reversed the order as the president. This returned all of the confiscated land to the owners who had owned it prior to the Civil War, kicking the newly freed blacks off of the colonies that they had just settled. Now, what this means is rather than having their own land that they could farm and that they could use to produce and establish economic freedom, they had to return to working for the people who had owned them prior to the Civil War. This resulted in years and years of sharecropping in which the freed slaves rented land from the people who had previously owned them and worked it, usually for no profit whatsoever. The meeting that happened upstairs here at the Green Meldrum House between General Sherman, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and the 20 free African American ministers would have changed the course of history for the freed African American community along the coast of Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida had Special Order 15 been allowed to stand. Unfortunately, Frazier was correct when he was asked about how he wanted the freed African American communities to live. There would be generations of racial discrimination that would exist throughout the South. The reversal of Special Field Order 15 took away the ability for these freed slaves, for the communities of African Americans throughout the Southeast, to establish a decades-long tradition of economic independence. Rather than getting land on which they could live safely and protect themselves as a community and pass that wealth on down through the generations, they were forced to return to a semi-slavery, working for their previous owners after the Civil War. This also opened them up to loads of racial violence led by the KKK and eventually legal segregation under Jim Crow laws in the South. If Special Order 15 had been allowed to stand, would these Jim Crow laws, would this racial violence have still happened? Probably. But it would have set the foundation for these freed African Americans to establish a new level of independence that they had not seen in this country up to that time.